Jobsworth, Season 1, Episode 8, The Fundamentals of Feedback. Welcome to Episode 8 of Jobsworth. This week I'm speaking with award-winning psychologist Dr. Hayley Lewis. Hayley has over 25 years of experience in organisational psychology with a particular focus on management and leadership behaviour. And in this episode, as you may have already guessed from the title, we do a deep dive on the psychology of feedback. I first came across Hayley when I spotted her incredible sketch notes on LinkedIn and was honoured when she said yes to being a guest on the show. With feedback, or a distinct lack of it, being a primary gripe for many people at work, or indeed during their job search, we talk about the fundamentals of giving and receiving it and whether we can improve our ability to do either of those things. Hayley's a true expert on this topic, offering valuable insights on the psychology of feedback, actionable tips on how to improve your relationship with it, and anecdotes from her own experience that provide fantastic examples to back up her points. Whether you seek feedback or avoid it, react badly to it or don't, there are some big takeaways from this episode. So, without further ado, let me introduce you to someone who's already radically changed my view on giving and receiving feedback. Dr. Hayley Lewis. Hayley, thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have the conversation.
And thank you for having me on your podcast. I'm really excited to see where our conversation goes.
Yeah, lovely stuff. You're very welcome. So the first place it's going to go to is an opening tradition on the podcast that has started now. And it's a question that I'm going to pose to you. So the question is, when you were younger, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Oh, gosh. So there were three things that competed with each other. Two of them in the same kind of area. So one was a ballerina, of course. So I did ballet as a little girl.
Yep.
And then the two that really stuck all the way through to when I did my GCSEs and A-levels was I wanted to be a policewoman, a police officer.
Okay.
Or a barrister.
Right, okay. I don't want to say this as a generalisation, but maybe a lot of little girls' dreams is ballerina. So I'm saying that's kind of par for the course for a lot of people.
Absolutely.
And then we go into police officer and then barrister. These are both upticks. What sort of age were you when the police officer and barrister came into play?
So police officer from about the age of 7.
Wow.
Right through until my late teens. I was born in 74, and I remember watching Juliet Bravo, so about this female police officer up north. Yeah. And I loved it. I loved her uniform. I loved the whole thing. I mean, that was about 1983, something like that.
Yep.
And then I've always had a very, and people, my close friends, colleagues, have said this about me. I've always had a very keen sense of justice and helping others, getting into fights in the playground, defending people who were being bullied. And I think wanting to then become a barrister really spoke to that. Yeah. The reason I didn't pursue law is I passed my 11 plus, went to a grammar school. Mm-hmm. And when we were doing our UCAS forms, my head teacher said I wasn't clever enough to do law. Okay. And it was all about making sure you got into university because obviously their stats look good. And so, I remember being called into the headmaster's office and he said, I see that you're applying to law at these universities. You're not quite going to cut it. So you might want to think about doing history or something like that. Yeah. And that was quite a common conversation for them to have.
Amazing.
Because it was about kids getting into university, not necessarily about the subjects that they wanted to do. So but law's loss.
Well, there you go. Exactly. It does lend itself to the subject that we're going to be discussing today, which is feedback. Because receiving that feedback, going through the application process at that age as well, I can imagine can be received in a number of ways. And I think in part of the preamble conversation we had to this, Hayley, you were talking about the fact that when you were younger, you weren't great at receiving feedback. So we'll delve into that in a bit more detail as well. Going back to your early, career. So from ballerina to aspiring police officer to barrister to then be told that route isn't for you. What then inspired you to move into psychology and specifically organisational psychology, which is a large element of what you do as well? What inspired you?
So I wasn't inspired.
Okay.
I was offered the opportunity. So I ended up doing a degree in social sciences at undergrad. My major was history because I've always loved history. And I did sociology and psychology alongside that. I graduated in the mid-90s, so 95, went out into the world, got any job I could, like many of us do, a series of dead-end jobs just to pay the rent. And I ended up getting an admin job at the BBC, kind of the mid-90s. So I was a coordinator for the BBC's conference centre, which it used to have at that point in Marylebone High Street. And I was asked with a number of other coordinators to go and help with a leadership team building event, which was going to be held up in the Lake District. This is back when the BBC had more money than God. And so I went up there, no expert, didn't have a blooming clue. Was there for 3 days, had an absolute blast. But I was really struck by the things that the leaders were being tasked with doing and so on and so forth. Anyway, as it so happens, on the last night before we all travelled back, I was seated next to the overall boss of the area. And so he was the controller of this particular area. And he said to me, he said, "What do you think of how it's gone, Hayley?" I mean, I was pretty precocious. I was kind of 24, nearly 25 at that point. I'd had a couple of glasses of red wine. And so I told him exactly what I thought. Yeah. I thought it was a waste of money. I couldn't see the outcomes they were trying to achieve. I could still see infighting between some of the leaders. And it was kind of this silence on the table. And anyway, on the train back home, I thought, oh, God, what have I done? And I thought, that's it, I'm fired. I did get called into my boss's office on the Monday, and I thought that was it. And actually, what she ended up saying to me was, the boss has said he was really impressed with you and he thinks you've got what it takes to be, you're just like a natural kind of social scientist, psychologist. Wow. Did you know we have an in-house psychology team? And we'd like almost to do a bit of an apprenticeship. And would you be interested in moving over there? We'll fund you on your masters. I mean, it wouldn't happen now, and I feel so lucky and privileged. I mean, this, as I say, this is back in the 90s. And I remember just kind of being struck dumb, and I remember going back to my desk, going on to Ask Jeeves, which was the search engine.
I remember it well.
Typing up, looking up what is occupational psychology, because we touched on applied psychology at undergrad, but hadn't specifically gone into the various domains. And I thought, yeah, I'll give it a go. So I applied to different universities and got a place on the master's programme at City University, London. And the rest is, as they say, history. So I've been in the field 25 years. So it I wasn't inspired to do it. It wasn't an intentional thing. It wasn't like I was 5 years old and I always yearned to be a psychologist. But as it happens, and as fate has smiled upon me, I've ended up being in a profession that I absolutely adore. So sorry, that was quite a long story. People never expect that story. But I think it's important context. It's not something I dreamed of doing, but now I feel really lucky that I do this.
It gives some really good context around how you get into it. And I think it's an important lesson for people to realise as well, is that you don't have to have a very clear idea of what you want to be when you're younger. And I am envious of people that are. My brother being an example of someone that had a very clear idea from the age of 10, 11 years old that he wanted to move into the field that he worked in. But yours is a story that I think so many people can relate to, which is you're given an opportunity and you take it with both hands and you go with it. So it's very relatable. It's not the answer that I thought you were going to give, but it's very relatable.
It's never the answer. And I say so I do a lot of careers talks with those training to be occupational psychologists, so on their master's programs. And one of the pieces of advice I always give is, if you're asked to give your opinion, give it, but make sure you give it in a productive way and seize opportunities where they can, because as the profession's got bigger and bigger, I mean, in the UK alone, we have around 700 people graduating each year from master's programs in the field. And so the field's becoming saturated. And so if there's an opportunity that presents itself to you, no matter how scary it is, give it a go. You never know where it might take you.
Yeah, that's a big lesson that I try and speak to people about as well. And it can seem a little bit glib sometimes giving that advice, but it's true. Like saying yes is one of the most powerful things you can do.
Although now I say no a lot more.
Well, that's because you've earned your stripes.
Yeah. I'm a lot more judicious about what I do and don't say.
And I think those boundaries that you've put in place, one of them being, I guess, we're just coming on the back of one of the boundaries that you put in place this year, which was taking August off as well.
That's right.
Which is an incredibly powerful thing to do, but maybe that's boundary setting is something for another episode. Okay, so you weren't inspired to move into the profession that you're in now, but do you have inspiration in the field you're working in now? Because I have had, since I've been the latter part of my time working in recruitment, maybe the last 5 or 6 years, I've had a real interest in organisational psychology. I'm gonna name drop. Not that he's going to listen to the podcast, but I'll name drop Adam Grant in the hope that he may listen one day. God, who knows? But Adam Grant is someone that I've read a couple of his books, and he really, I guess, just acted as the pathway, the entrance for me to start having a bit more of a conceptual understanding, at least, of organisational psychology. Yeah. Any inspiration in the field for you that you look to and kind of look up to?
Yeah, I mean, Adam is definitely up there. I mean, I have to say that because he used one of my sketch notes in his last book.
Oh my God. Okay.
Yeah. Oh,
amazing.
Yeah. That's a story for another day. But yeah, I think the thing I love about Adam is he's made the work that we do as scientists. Well, so he's obviously on the science side. I'm a scientist practitioner in that I have a foot in both camps around research and practice. He's made it really accessible to the public. I think there are others who I've been inspired by, some of whom are no longer with us. For example, Edgar Schein. He is someone that I cite quite a lot with students. I cite him a lot in my work. I often post about Edgar's work because years on after his death, his work still has a really profound impact on the world of work and organisational culture and what it is to be a good leader. Gosh, who else? Others who inspire me. So doctors Hayley Lewis and Joanna Yarker, they are doing brilliant work in the area of health and well-being in the workplace. They also set up the first doctorate programme in occupational psychology in the UK, which myself and Dr. Claire Mulligan-Foster have now taken over. So yeah, they're hugely inspirational in the work that they do. Dr. Nancy Doyle doing amazing work around neurodiversity in the workplace, and who helped co-establish the UK's first ever neurodiversity centre for work.
Wow.
At Birkbeck. So yeah, gosh, there's so many people, and I get inspired by clients and students alike. You know, I feel so lucky to do what I do. I've kind of got the best of both worlds, and I get to meet people from all walks of life. So my practice as a coach and a consultant, I meet amazing people. My passion is the public sector. I spent 11 years working in the public sector for a while. And just hugely inspirational people, you know, from nurses to care assistants to social workers to planners to backroom, staff like HR, doing amazing things to help the public, but with often very little money or very little thanks. And then my students at Birkbeck on the doctorate programme, I'm just inspired by their passion, the amazing work they do. We ran the weekend school, the latest weekend school, Claire and I, for the doctorate last weekend, and one of the things we get the students to do is share their most recent projects and they're learning from that. And I felt quite tearful, like hearing from 4 of our second year students, just the work they're doing is having such a big impact on organisations in the UK and around the world. See how I get inspired every day, John.
I love that. There was so much enthusiasm in that response as well, and I love it. It's so amazing, and it's easy to name drop the bigger, more well-known names working in this space, but I think the point you make about your students and the people you meet on a daily basis inspiring you as well, that probably lends itself to the success you've had in this space, because you need to be inspired by the people you work with, the people you speak to, and the people you're putting these messages out to as well. So that's amazing. I'm definitely going to go back to speak about the Adam Grant link, because I never knew that, and that is just, as a fanboy of Adam Grant, that's a huge connection. So amazing.
I think I'm on page 163 of Think Again, if anybody has read it. Just saying.
Got it at home, that's the thing.
Something like that. Yeah. You think I should know the page number?
Well, I'm surprised that you were able to reference one of them, but I guess you would know, wouldn't you? Okay, so we talked about inspiration. Could you share maybe a moment in your career, or someone in your career, one of the people you've worked with that shaped the approach that you have today? And I guess it lends itself, organisational psychology, for the conversation and the catalyst that happened at the BBC. But is there a moment or a particular individual that inspired your approach that you use today?
The first person who had a profound impact on me, particularly around important conversations and feedback, and doing that in a powerful way, is the late Dr. Mian Chung Judge. So she took me under her wing in the early part of my career. She came in to do some work with the BBC on the Culture Change programme when Greg Dyke was Director General, and I just feel really lucky to have had her light shone on me, even kind of for that short period of time. But she wrote a brilliant article, and it's one that I share with students and OD, so organisational development practitioners. It's called The Self as an Instrument. And I don't think that's an article that's just relevant for those of us who are practitioners in this space. I think it's relevant for anybody in a leadership position as well, about the impact you in your body can have on the environment around you. And just watching her in action as well, she could hold a room like no one else I've ever met. And I think one of the reasons was she just oozed respect for people, even in really difficult conversations. So that's the first person who had an impact on me. The second moment that had an impact on me, I went on a brilliant programme. It no longer runs now, I don't think, but it was back in 2003 with a company called Shepherd Moscow, and it was their advanced development for facilitators, and they only ever allowed a maximum of 6 people because it's a deep programme, and it can lead to tears and all sorts. So you get feedback on your facilitation style, which includes how you have difficult conversations with groups or one-on-one, and you're really put through your paces. I mean, there were 2 chief execs in my group, and I remember a couple of them in bits. And so I was taught some frameworks on that, as well as confronted with my own unhelpful behaviours around facilitation and giving feedback and important conversations. So that was a second important moment.
Can I ask a quick question, Hayley, if that's okay? Just on that, when the execs in that group were showing that level of emotion, that level of vulnerability, is that something that is welcomed and kind of nurtured? Or are you taught ways in which as leaders you're supposed to kind of suppress that? Is there a balance? Is there a mid-ground? Or should we be vulnerable?
So I think it depends. I don't think it's an either or, John.
Okay.
I'm a big believer in context. If any of my students end up listening to this, they'll roll their eyes because there's not a day goes by when I don't use it, and some of my clients will as well. I don't use the word context. It depends. Right. So in some instances, it probably would be great for a leader in a certain situation to just show a bit of vulnerability. But there are others where actually people want to feel in safe hands.
Right. Yep.
They want to feel that strength from you. And so there's something about reading the situation well and knowing how much to give and how much to expose of yourself, and when you might want to kind of roll it back a little bit. But great question, and it's a common question that I get asked in recent years. It came up on Saturday, actually, with the students about vulnerability in leadership.
As leaders, you've got a responsibility, haven't you? And I can cite a couple of experiences of, I've been fortunate enough. I have worked for myself a large part of my career, but when I've had leaders, there have been times where I admired the fact that they could keep their shit together or not, I guess, expose that vulnerability. And times when it did happen, and it kind of shakes your reality a little bit as well, and makes you, and that can not always be the most positive thing if someone is exposing themselves to that degree. So I get it. It is all about context, but I thought I'd interject and ask.
It depends what you are. Yeah, no, great question. It depends what you're exposing and in what context. There's also something about, you have to take into account different societal factors. So my passion, my research area is women and women in the world of work. There was a great book I read this year by Geraldine Gallagher about coaching women. I think the subtitle is Changing the System, Not the Person. Right. And so leaders need to remember their role models. And so if I think about women in leadership, and this is borne out in quite a lot of research as well, as a young woman, if I'm moving, if I have career aspirations, but I hit that certain point and I'm at that crossroads where I'm looking at those around me and all I'm seeing is women kind of that giant shoulder pads, hard, can't show your emotion because that's been the only way to get ahead. Well, then I think that's the only way I can be a leader. And so there's something incumbent on leaders about what are you role modelling to those coming up behind you. Yep. So whether I'm a woman leader, whether I'm a black leader, whether I'm male or female, or I'm gay. What am I role modelling? Because I have a responsibility not just to myself and my immediate team, but I also have a responsibility in terms of who, like me, is looking at me and coming up behind me years down the line. And so that's where that vulnerability aspect can come in helpful. And it's a question that I often explore with leadership coaching clients, particularly maybe who've lost their way, they've lost connection, or maybe they're at the start of their career. It's what legacy do you want to have?
Yeah, I think legacy comes up a lot.
What do you want people to be saying about you? What do you want people to be saying about you after you've gone? And to what extent is that likely to be said about you now based on how you are now? Yeah. And often there can be a bit of a gap. But anyway, I digress.
Well, let's get.
You're going to have to work. You're going to have to work hard to pull me back because I can go off all over the place, John.
This is what I love about having conversations like this, though, and there's no harm with a bit of digression and going off on some tangents. It all very, very loosely, some of this, but all relates to the topic of feedback anyway. And I think it's important to discuss. So yeah, go off on any tangent you want to go off. It's all valuable stuff. Okay. Any more moments that you feel it's important to just identify as things? Yeah.
The third one was, I think, pivotal to how I thought about and handled feedback as a line manager. So very early on in my line management journey, so this is when I'd moved into local government at this point, I had to restructure one of the teams in my service area, and some people got made redundant. Long story short, there was a member of the team who got made redundant. There was some very questionable behaviour, shall we say, and I confronted that, and anyway, they took a grievance out and so on and so forth. But I had lots of evidence and HR kind of found in my favour. But this person then took the local authority to tribunal. And actually, it wasn't just about me. Unbeknownst to me, this person had been in the local authority a long time, like 20 years. And so what ended up coming through the tribunal was like a long litany of their anger and disgruntlement at every manager they'd ever worked with. Wow. And I remember being, as a rule following, I'm very rule following. As a working class girl, working hard, it was always about being perfect and kind of not doing anything wrong. And so I felt like I was in trouble, to find out that there was a tribunal. And I remember my boss at the time, the HR director, who is still a mentor for me now, very wisely said, you don't earn your stripes as a manager with the day-to-day, the easy stuff. It's moments like this that you earn your stripes.
That's a great point.
That's always stuck with me. That's nearly 20 years ago now. It's something that I share with managers that I work with. When I managed managers, so when I was in a senior leadership role in local government, one of the things that I used to get them to do to take the fear out, because I think there's a lot of fear of the unknown, and that's what can hold us back from having really important, honest conversations as line managers. Mm-hmm. And so if I'm frightened of saying the wrong thing, if I'm frightened then that I'm going to get in trouble, if I'm frightened there's going to be a grievance or disciplinary or, God forbid, a tribunal, kind of reverse engineer from that and say it's easier for me, it's better for me to say nothing. And actually I turn that on its head. And so every year with my management team that reported into me, I tell them that they could do this whenever they want, they just needed to kind of plan their time. But near us was one of the tribunal courts for London. Mm-hmm. It was like up the road. And most cases are public. So I'd say to them, at one point this year, go and sit in one of the hearings, and I want you to come back and bring your findings, and we'll talk about it in our management team meeting in terms of where you think that thing went wrong.
Yep.
And so we'd have a bit of a case discussion. And so I treated it as management development, if you like.
Wow.
But also as a way to take the fear out of the unknown. And more often than not, what came out in our discussions, what came out of their learning when they observed these court cases in action is where a conversation hadn't happened at the right point, or a conversation had been mishandled in some way, or the communication was just poor in general, either from the line manager or the member of staff or both.
Yep.
And so, so that my own experience of that and coming out the other side, I think it really gave me a strength and courage, and also reinforced the importance of honest conversations. And not avoiding them.
I think if we zoom out for most problems that might arise in any part of our lives later down the line as well, if you look in hindsight or retrospectively, it's always down to something that's been missing. So it's a lack of something at some point in our development, whether that's through a career or for just over the course of this conversation, if it went a certain way, we could probably pinpoint, if we started arguing, Hayley, it's probably going to be able to be pinpointed on something that wasn't said or miscommunicated. And I think that's a really good point to make. And probably it was a great lesson in resilience for you as well.
Yeah, like absolutely. Absolutely.
You grow from those moments, don't you, for sure?
I mean, it was brutal at the time, and there were days where I was crying. And I remember, I mean, as well as the HR director, who was my boss, who was amazing, she was an absolute rock. But she didn't bat an eyelid with it. And she kept saying to me, remember, it's not you who's you are representing the authority, because this person's complaining against the authority. But the barrister as well, we had a barrister, and I was like, oh, he's a barrister. But he blew my mind. But I remember him coming in with his assistant with almost like a pulley trolley of all the files pertaining to
oh my God.
And I thought, and that also reinforced, it's not just about me. Okay, so this person's made many complaints over the years. But yeah, absolutely. I came out the other side, I think, a stronger, more confident line manager. But also it reinforced further, and this is where my training as a psychologist comes in, because I do this anyway, is the importance of really good evidence. So not what you're assuming something is, not your own bias coming in. It's kind of what are the facts, and are you talking about those facts? Because that's often where feedback conversations can go wrong, when it's not factual and evidence based. And again, that was my own learning journey with that, really.
And brilliant, and that helps us. I mean, I'm sorry you had to go through it at the time, but it helps us for this conversation and the listeners listening now, because it shaped a lot, I guess, of the advice and support and mentorship that you give people now. What you say resonates about facts. I've had a fair amount of therapy in the last 6 or 7 years, and it's kind of when you are asked to analyse what you're thinking about, half of it is the internal monologue, internal narrative in your head that is completely fictional. So taking a step back and separating that from what is the black and white of what you can see right now? Like, let's take all the noise away and look at the bare bones and the skeleton of it. Is what you've got in your head true or correct or accurate? 9 times out of 10, when you're having those moments and feeling a certain way, it's not true. So yeah, factual stuff is really important.
Well, and this is where, so my training as a researcher, as a scientist, so that side of my life as a psychologist, we don't use the language of true or false. We say the data suggests, or findings suggest, and I just think that can be more powerful and also lend itself to being heard. Than if you're stating something as a truism.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
You know, as a line manager, based on this evidence, this suggests to me that you might be having a problem with your workload. Let's have a conversation about that.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Which is a very different conversation than this data tells me that you're rubbish at your job, or this data tells me you can't do your job, which is more black and white.
Yeah, completely right. So,
and I know you're laughing because I can imagine people going, nobody says that, do they? They do, because when I do conflict resolution work and I do my kind of research and I speak to all the parties concerned, conversations like that do happen.
Yeah, I'll be honest, over 12 years of recruitment and hearing people's grievances for why they want to leave jobs, I'm aware of it. The laugh was more because it actually reminds me of so many anecdotes that people have told me over the years as to why they're leaving or why they're not sticking with a company, and being told in that direct way. And it's easy as someone, I'd love to label myself as an empath, and someone that maybe, I think empathy is quite a valuable asset when you're giving feedback and receiving feedback as well. But hearing that, I'm like, how could anyone be, for me, that is a sign of apathy, not being in touch, maybe a lack of emotional intelligence as well. So I laugh because it actually reminds me of so many anecdotes that I've heard over the years. So I get that.
But it's also what we put a premium on, societally. And obviously, if I think about the UK context, but also the US has a big impact on us. In terms of workplace culture. But even the language, this has come up quite a lot recently with clients that I'm working with, where leaders talk about the need to be brutally honest, like it's something to be proud of. And I always, because I'm fascinated by words and discourse, and so I always pick up on that. I'm really curious about, why does it need to be brutal? Why can't you just be honest?
That's a good point.
What's the difference between being honest and being brutally honest? And why do we need to be brutal? And I think it's what we're taught in this kind of society, particularly a kind of a capitalist society. It's almost kind of kill or be killed. It's that kind of macho, you've got to be really strong, you've got to be brutally honest. And, my husband and I were talking about this last night. I used to be a massive fan of The Apprentice when it first started, so like the first couple of series, but I can't bear to watch it now because I think it's, from my perspective, it's almost like a parody of all that's bad about business and what it takes to be a good business owner and a good leader. And it's, you got to talk to people like they're pieces of shit. And no, there is another way, and you're absolutely spot on. There was some research a couple of years ago. I know why you're laughing. There was some research from 2018 that suggests that leaders who display empathy when giving difficult feedback are seen as more effective at giving feedback by the feedback recipient.
Interesting. Okay.
So empathy has a really powerful impact, and yet we're taught by these programs and so on and so forth that no, that's not the right way, and actually the science suggests otherwise. So you're absolutely spot on.
2 points I want to make. One on The Apprentice. I think the reason it's getting so bad over the years, and I used to watch it in the first couple of, is because there's so many recruitment consultants on it, number one. Number two, I can say that. Number two is going back to the point you made about brutal honesty. So there's a book, I think the book is called Radical Candour.
Yes, by Kim Scott.
There you go. So Radical Candour, in a way, is that not, maybe it doesn't translate as brutal honesty, but radical candour, there is elements of that, and businesses are using the term radical candour from a leadership perspective to be able to, is that masking?
Kim definitely didn't mean it as brutal honesty.
Okay.
And she has a 3-step approach. So I give people lots of different options when I'm teaching them about giving and receiving feedback, and I share Kim's framework. And what's really interesting about Kim's framework is the giving feedback, and that really honest conversation is the 3rd stage.
Right.
Actually, before you even get to that, you're giving praise. The next stage is you are asking for feedback as the leader. So you're role modelling, you're asking for feedback, you're showing that feedback isn't something to be scared of, and you're role modelling how to receive it before you even get to that. And yeah, certainly, and if you kind of ever listen to Kim talk about the work that she's done and the work that influenced the book, she doesn't mean the brutal honesty in the way that you and I have been talking about it. That's not what she meant by radical candour.
Yeah.
Radical in the idea that it's still not the norm to have honest conversations. We veer away from them, we avoid them still.
Yep.
And that candour is around, don't beat around the bush, just tell someone. And again, research bears this out. There was some German research from 2007 that says when we're having to give difficult feedback, people will go an indirect route, but actually all that does is serves to wind the person up because they know something's coming.
Yeah.
And we've all been there, haven't we? I've been there where I'm like, you're in your head, you're like, get to the point, and it's almost like shaking a wasp in a jar.
Yeah.
And so the candour bit is just state what it is you want to say to the person. Doesn't mean you need to be a dick about it.
Yep.
Honest feedback, radical candour, whatever you want to call it, doesn't mean you need to be horrible about it. You can be compassionate when you're doing it. Brené Brown, in her book Dare to Lead, talks about to be clear is to be kind. The unkindest act a leader can ever do is to not be clear in their feedback, go all around the houses, be really indirect.
Yeah.
Because you're leaving the person vulnerable.
That all makes complete sense. And there's been, like, in my time as a manager, which didn't last long, primarily because I chose to leave. I didn't particularly enjoy leadership, but probably it's because the leaders that I had role modelling for me weren't giving me the skills, I think, and the development I needed. I would have liked to think I was good at giving feedback, but half the time I was doing exactly that, skirting around the difficult issue, or probably being too direct, and then framing it as being brutally honest is going to help you, which wasn't the case. Yeah. Going back to Radical Candour, I will say this as well. I haven't read Kim's book. I've heard it referenced so many times by leaders, and I think it can act as a plaster to go over, we're just going to be brutally honest. It can do.
Yeah.
The difference with the framework, I think, as you were saying it there, the last part is to have an honest conversation. I guess the success of that relies on you embracing and really wanting to adopt the first two sections. Because in my cynical mind, think leaders might go, oh, let's just tick those two boxes and then let's just be brutally honest at the end of it.
Yeah, that's a really, really insightful point you've just made, because Kim also talks about this in the book. Right. Where she says there are two golden rules. You've got to care enough about the person to go there and have that conversation. And then two, you've got to commit to it. You can't kind of half step off. It always makes me think of that scene in Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade. I love film references where he has to have that leap of faith.
Yeah.
Like step it. You think there's no bridge. That's what she's talking about. You've got to commit. There's no half-assed measures here. And so, but I think the first golden rule of you've got to care about the person. Yeah. And sometimes I will ask that conversation, if in a coaching conversation, so with one of my coaching clients, if there's an issue between maybe them and one of their direct reports, and there's a conversation that they're avoiding, I ask them, do you care enough about the other person to go there?
That's a great question.
Which is often met with stunned silence. And I allow the silence as well. Somebody shared one of my really old sketch notes about 6 tips for having a difficult conversation. It's a very old sketch note. They shared it on LinkedIn this week. And there's been a conversation on the back of that in the comments thread about one of the 6 suggestions I make, which is about the power of silence. Many of us don't use silence enough in feedback conversations, or indeed one-to-one conversations, but silence is powerful. Yeah. Not used in an evil Machiavellian way, but just allowing the person to process. Yeah. Just allowing it, both of you in the room, to just sit with what's been said. It's okay to do that. Yeah,
they're lessons that I could take a lot from, I think, in both my personal relationship, both in speaking to candidates as well about jobs, or leaders about hiring. Slightly different one to take into a podcast, isn't it? Long silences as well. But I do completely understand what you're saying. I think silence is so incredibly powerful. And there's you watch enough kind of sales people speak about the power of silence as well, and just letting those messages be digested. You've gone on to answer a lot of the questions that I had as well that are moving through this, which is why I love going off on tangents.
Can I share a powerful moment that really drove home for me? Silence. The power of silence.
I'm not going to say no.
Yeah, because I always use it with clients, and then we come up with tactics they can try out to build their silence muscle. So the leadership team I was part of, this was a long time ago now, there was a leadership team I was part of. There'd been lots of friction. One of the team members had been fired. It had sent a ripple effect across the leadership team. We just weren't performing as a result. There was no trust, so on and so forth. And so the director of the team knew something needed to be done. And so there were 10 of us in total. She brought in an external facilitator from the Tavistock Institute.
Okay.
So this will be someone with deep therapeutic expertise, but using it in a group setting.
Yep.
And so anyway, so we sat in the obligatory circle, of course we did. And he opened up, he said, tell me how it's feeling at the moment for you. Everyone looked at the floor because no one wanted to be the first one to speak. I kid you not, John. 5 minutes silence we sat there.
Wow.
Because I watched the clock and you could hear the clock ticking.
Oh.
And but that wasn't the thing that I noticed. What I noticed more than that, I kept looking out the corner of my eye. Because here was I was only 10 years into less than 10 years into my career as a psychologist at that point. So I was like fascinated with this other practitioner. I kept looking out the corner of my eye. And this guy was so comfortable in his own skin. He did not seem ruffled by the silence. He might have been inside, but he had this benign smile. He had his notepad. He'd smile at us if we caught his eye. And then he'd look out the window into the gardens. Just so centred and calm. It goes back to Mian's paper on self as an instrument. 5 minutes later, what do you think happened?
Someone has to have broken at some point. I couldn't have lasted 5 minutes.
Someone broke. It was me. Someone broke. But then the conversation that took place over the next hour and a half was so powerful. But the thing I took away more than the conversation was this guy.
Yeah.
And I thought, I want to be like that. I want to be like that. I want to exude. Silence isn't something to be frightened of or sitting there fidgeting or just, this is just a space that we're in. And so I've really worked on that ever since then. And it's something that I do a lot of work on with clients as well, around how to build your silence muscle.
Is that aligned with meditation at all, Hayley, and mindfulness? Has that got any links in your mind around it, or is it a very different thing? Potentially.
Yeah, I think there are definitely some links. I mean, I've been meditating regularly since 2012. So when I was in a leadership role and I essentially had a breakdown, and part of my way back and kind of building myself back up was incorporating meditation practice. But I think also for some there's personality as well. There will be some people. So one of my close friends who I used to work with and has become a really good friend, really comfortable with silence. She's a very clear introvert. Doesn't feel the need to fill the room with her voice all the live long day.
Great skill.
So I think it's a variety of things.
Yeah.
But it is a skill, those of us who are a bit more chatty, it is a skill we can learn, because my clients are testament to that.
Yeah, interesting. And it's a skill that I've been mindful of, definitely embarking upon this podcast journey and speaking to people, because I do have a tendency to fill silences. I have a tendency I don't think it's with the intention of just making noise all the time. I'm probably, in my mind, I don't know if it's the silence making me uncomfortable or feeling that the silence might make the other person uncomfortable. So I am starting to very slowly be more comfortable with it, but it is uncomfortable. I'm saying uncomfortable and comfortable a lot, but hopefully that makes sense.
But there's also something about calling it out. It doesn't have to be this secret. So, for example, if I'm working with somebody who's a line manager and they recognise that actually one of the things that's getting in the way of their relationships with staff and important conversations is their tendency to jump in if, God forbid, a person doesn't respond in a nanosecond, is around becoming comfortable with that. Also, putting it out there. So saying to people, you might notice I'm going to be a bit quieter, and it's something that I'm trying out because I want to create more space. Whereas if you don't say anything, it can just feel really awkward and weird for the other person or persons, because suddenly you're behaving differently, but they don't know why.
Yes.
It doesn't have to be a secret. Actually, if you're working on something, if you're developing yourself as a leader, as a manager, or just as a person, often it can be helpful to tell others about that so they can help you on your journey. I can't believe I used the word journey. I'm rolling my own eyes now. Don't worry.
It comes up a lot in the first season of Jobsworth. It came up a lot, and it will come up a lot again. Don't worry at all. Okay, so I'll share a personal experience as well from my relationship, in that I'm notoriously a fixer in my relationship. So if my partner comes to me with a problem, all she really wants me to do, and I've learnt this from therapy as well, is to listen and to be a sounding board and to hold her and to not fix it. But I think I probably get this from my mum. It's a character trait I've inherited, I reckon. I just want to fix it. So there's no silence. There is, right, let's come up with something actionable for me to try and do that's going to make you feel better and drag you out of where you are at the moment. And I've learnt the hard way on some occasions that that's not what you need to do. So whether it's silence or whether it's just, I hear what you're saying, I understand, and I'm here. And that's a hard lesson for me to have learned. But just in case that resonates with anyone else, it came to mind.
That will resonate with a lot of people, I think. And you saw me put my hands up because that's an example I often share when I'm running workshops with managers on whether it's kind of creating a psychologically safe culture and or having important conversations and giving feedback. There's a framework that I share. I've got a free download actually on my website, so if people are interested in that, I can send you the link.
Brilliant.
John.
Thank you.
But around support challenge, because there's something around stop trying to guess what the rules of the game are, ask each person. So this tool encourages those who are managers, for example, although some people use it with their families as well, but it encourages managers with each direct report to have that one-to-one conversation around how they want to be supported and actually what's the best way for the manager to challenge them in a way that means they won't get defensive.
Yeah.
But here's the thing, it's a two-way conversation. So then the manager talks about how they can be challenged and also the kind of support that they want. And the example I always share is similar to yours. I give the example of when my husband was being bullied at work a long time ago. He would come home and he would, because he's very quiet, but so if he was ranting, I knew this was bad. With my old HR hat on, and as a problem solver similar to you, I go, well, what you need to do is, you need to go and see your HR rep, blah, 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 blah. And there was one night, and he doesn't have a temper at all, but one night, and he just said, I just want you to listen. I don't want you to tell me what I need to do or who I need to. I'm just letting off steam. And that was like, wow, that's a reminder that our love language isn't necessarily the love language the other person wants, if you like.
It's a great point. Love language is something that a mutual connection of ours introduced me to, actually. Jen Lister introduced me to love languages, and I ended up doing that the questionnaire online as well, and that was that's quite an eye-opener. But anyway, that's again another conversation, I reckon. But yeah, it's I've had experiences like that where Sophie, my partner, has just had to say, I don't need you to do anything. I just need you to listen, and that's it. So I think again, that's
I just want to rant.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And again, that might be the case at work. So as a line manager, if you're a natural problem, you want to solve it. Actually, what you need to understand is for that person, there might be one of your direct reports who that doesn't work for. They want to bounce ideas off, and the important thing is create the ground rules for each relationship, because they'll be different, and it's your job to adapt as a manager, not the other way around. Yeah. But to do that, you need to understand the rules of the game.
Okay, fantastic point. Right, I've got some questions directly around feedback. They may draw out concise answers, or they may lead us to more tangents, which we've got some time to go into this, so hopefully that's okay. Why does feedback make people so uncomfortable? What is it about feedback? It's a generalisation to say that most people will feel uncomfortable with feedback, but I think it's a fair one. But what makes people so uncomfortable about receiving and giving feedback?
So I think in terms of giving feedback, I think there's a couple of things that influences our anxiety. I think the first is our own experience of being given it and being given it badly. I think the second thing is, and this is the more prevalent, I find, is our imaginations run riot. So the question I always ask managers is, what do you think is going to happen when you say this thing? And sometimes our minds will kind of career off into the stratosphere, into fantasy land. And I say, do you think it's going to be like the Jerry Springer show? When you say this thing, do you think the person's going to pick the chair up and smash it across the room? Or are they going to punch you? Or, oh, no. Right, so what do you think is going to happen? But our imaginations can run riot, particularly the longer we leave it. So I think those are the two things, both of which are to do with our minds. So prior experience and then our imaginations running riot, which also And I think some of us allow our imaginations to run riot because it lets us off the hook, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Lets us off the hook doing the difficult thing.
Yep, definitely. Okay. So what about receiving?
Well, in terms of receiving feedback, again, there's an overlap with giving. We might have had bad experience in the past with other managers or this manager, and so kind of we're on red alert already. There might also be other things. There's kind of wider context going on. You know, if there's a restructure in your organisation and your manager says, could we have a chat? I mean, that's just the ultimate, isn't it? When your manager says, could we have a chat?
Yes.
That combined with, there's going to be layoffs is going to put you on high alert.
Yeah, anxiety and...
Absolutely. So there's a number of things that can kind of feed into it, but they're the ones that kind of tend to come up the most when I dig into it with people in workplaces.
So it's the history and the prior experience, and then also this is around receiving it, and then the context as well, which again, your students will be rolling their eyes on hearing context, but I think it's an important point to make. So do you think it's a fair point to say that the majority of people, albeit a generalisation, the majority of people are uncomfortable to some degree about giving and receiving feedback?
I think that's fair to say, yeah.
Okay.
I work with hundreds of managers each year across different sectors, different organisations around the world. And in my own experience before kind of running my business, it was the thing that people would avoid the most. So I think broadly, it's not something that people kind of get excited about.
I can't imagine anyone does. But yeah, I thought it was important to qualify.
But why not? It's an opportunity for a really important conversation to have, to help a person, to have a profound impact on them, to maybe make them aware of something that maybe they weren't aware of, but could make a really big difference to their working lives or even to their personal life. It's really interesting that we don't see it as an opportunity.
I'm gonna answer your why not question with, I think it's the stigma, it's previous experience, it's probably the fact that no one works on delivering feedback, so it does come across as either brutally honest or shaking a wasp in a jar, which is why services like yours are around, Hayley, and why you show such an interest in it as well. So I definitely think there's a
or
stigma.
David Brent. Or the David Brent approach, which is you say something but you're saying nothing.
Yes.
And so the person goes away from the conversation not having a clue as to what was that was about. I see that a lot.
Yeah, there's a famous scene. Yeah, there's a famous scene with the performance appraisal in the British office, isn't there, as well, where he's sat there across the desk and he's basically saying absolutely bugger all. And
exactly.
The imagery is there. Yeah.
That's really common.
Okay.
And so many of us have been taught I've kind of taken it upon myself to bust this myth of the shit sandwich that many of us have been taught as a technique. Give a bit of praise, wedge in the difficult feedback and then finish with praise. We now know that does not work.
Shit sandwich. I'm sorry. I'm still laughing at the...
I know. But it doesn't work. And as I talked about earlier, most people have a sense of, okay, there's something clearly this person wants to say to me. And when you're wasting time going, oh, you've done a really, you've given them some flannel, actually you're just putting it off. You're wasting time. You're winding the person up. You're probably winding yourself up. Just cut to the chase. But you can still deliver that fact, but do it in a compassionate, understanding way.
Okay.
But yeah, it doesn't work.
No. I mean, it's a great... I don't think I've ever heard it called a shit sandwich before, but I've been a recipient of a shit sandwich on a number of occasions in the context of feedback, and I would agree. It's so obvious as well as a tool to be using. It's so obvious what is coming. So good news. Oh, wait a minute, this is going a different direction, and then a pat on the back or some false thing to leave you feeling, or false positive, basically a placebo to leave you walking out the door feeling like that feedback that wasn't that bad. It's just rubbish. Hayley, I'm gonna ask you this question now, and I'm confident I know the answer already because this is part of why we're having the conversation. Can you train yourself? I'm going to ask how. How do you train yourself to be better at giving and receiving feedback? And I appreciate answering this question in the time we have left, you could take up the rest of this time, but can you give some indication of how you can train yourself to be better?
Yeah, well, first of all, you need some feedback on what it's like to get feedback from you. You know, so you might have some behaviours that you hope you demonstrate. You might want to, you know, do your own little version of a 360 feedback, for example, but get some evidence. I mean, one of the Professor Bob Sutton talks about this in his brilliant book, Good Boss, Bad Boss, about, you know, the best managers, the best leaders regularly ask for feedback. They don't wait for a formal kind of annual performance appraisal or 360 feedback. They kind of do it themselves. And this is something that I encourage any of my clients to do, which is, you know, even if it's every quarter or a couple of times a year, just having some standard questions you ask people, and they can respond anonymously if they're more comfortable doing that. But yeah, get feedback on your feedback giving, because that then will tell you the things specifically that to work on, but also some strengths that you can leverage. I think get some support. So whether you've got somebody else at your level who's a really good friend or a close colleague that you can bounce ideas off, or even role play stuff. If you know you've got a conversation you've got to have and you're feeling a little bit worried about it, do a dry run with someone. People don't do that enough, but often when my clients do that, they always come back to the next coaching session going, I wish I'd done that before. Because again, it almost takes the fear out of it. And you can get some feedback from your colleague as well. You can go on training courses, you can get a mentor. So there might be someone more senior than you who you think, wow, they're brilliant at honest conversations. They do it really elegantly. Why not ask them to take you under their wing, mentor, ask them for advice, get a coach? So there's a number of things you can do, but I say start with getting some evidence first. Yeah. Actually baseline where you are. The NHS has I don't know if they still use it, but it's a framework that I share with people on my feedback workshop. I'll share it with you after. You can kind of share it with people.
That'd be great, yeah.
After, but it's a competency framework. It's a 5-level. So there's 5 levels for you to achieve around feedback giving. So it's one of the essential competencies. And so at one end, it's, you know, basically you're rubbish, like giving feedback, all the way through to level 5, where not only do you give feedback really well, you role model how to give it, you role model how to receive feedback, you proactively ask for feedback. And I really like that because there's a journey to go on. So I'll send that over to you, John, because you might find that helpful and your listeners might find that helpful as well. As I say, I don't know if the NHS still uses it, but certainly they did at one point, and I think it's a fabulous framework to help us think about the journey that we can go on to build our feedback muscle.
Yeah, if we can find that, and then we will share that in the podcast description as well.
I'll ping it over to you after.
Brilliant. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to ask you a really specific question now then, because one of the reasons that inspired this conversation and me reaching out to you, Hayley, was, this is going to be a point where I talk about recruitment, and I try not to do this as much as possible in this podcast, but my job as a recruiter, and one of the primary gripes of the recruitment industry and a stereotype that I'm trying to change is candidates would cite lack of feedback as the number one problem with the recruitment industry or dealing with recruiters. Now, I've tried to tackle that stigma by giving feedback. And I think I'm going to know the answer to part of this question at least anyway. The feedback that I give is often received in a negative way, and it kind of manifests itself in one of 2 ways. It's potentially a bit of denial and then getting quite angry about having received that feedback and pushing it on to the person that's giving it, because obviously I'm just relaying the feedback, or taking it very personally and becoming quite negative about it, and letting that affect confidence as well. I am going to defend the recruitment industry to a degree that people are asking for feedback, and when we're giving it, again, a generalization, it's received in one of those negative ways. Why is that, and what can we be doing more of to improve that whole process and ensure that feedback is taken in the way that it's intended?
Yeah, okay, great. I mean, yeah, a gritty issue. I think first and foremost, I want to say you can't force people to take it in the spirit in which it's intended. That's their responsibility. Yep. So I always say this to people that I work with on this topic, Every relationship, every conversation is a 50-50 responsibility. And the only bit you can take responsibility for is your 50%. So as a recruiter, I would imagine my 50% is, have I been factual? Have I given helpful information? Have I signposted someone on next steps? And have I been respectful?
Yep.
So you might have some criteria. If you've met those, that's all you can do. The recipient's responsibility is to listen, is to ask questions, is to not lose their temper.
Mm-hmm.
And that's their responsibility. There's also something about, I'm a great believer in using evidence in the moment. So when I worked at the BBC, I worked very closely with recruitment. So I was responsible for running big scale assessment centres with recruitment colleagues. Right. And I remember we had this big campaign. It was very competitive. You had young journalists wanting to get onto the new sponsorship scheme, incredibly competitive. And it was such an evidence base. So they had to go through a day of different exercises. I mean, the reports on each person were incredibly detailed. And there was one guy who didn't get a place. I gave him his feedback. He gave me a bit of jip on the phone, but that was to be expected. Did it end there? No, because I was on the tube going home one night from Broadcasting House.
Right.
Got on the tube, Oxford Circus. And at the corner of my eye, I saw this blur stamping down the tube. I thought, what's going on here? Looked over, it was the guy.
No way.
He came over and stood in front of me, towered over me, and said, I don't agree. I can't believe I didn't get a place. And I said to him, I can't believe I had the wherewithal to... But I said, what you're doing here only serves to reinforce as evidence of why you shouldn't be on the programme. And it just struck him dumb. But again, there's something about, are you using what's coming across in the moment as evidence to reinforce the feedback that you're giving, for example? And many of us don't necessarily do that. So whether you're a recruiter, whether you're a line manager, but that can be really powerful and can often be enough to almost be a bit of a shock to the person.
Yeah, because
it's like, if somebody starts shouting at you on the phone, I would say, you're shouting at me. I'm giving you feedback in a really calm way. I know it's not what you want to hear because you wanted the job, and I get that you're upset. But the fact that you're not able to control your temper and you're shouting at me only reinforces the kind of data that we got or the decision that's been made.
Yeah, I understand that. Because I think most people that want to do the job well want to provide the right service to the people they're representing. And the ideal scenario is that you don't have to call people with negative feedback at all and everyone gets a job from both sides. But more often than not, one person's getting a job and there's a good number of people that won't. And all you want to do is try and help those people constructively. Yeah. And I guess some of it comes down to that discomfort about telling someone negative feedback, or however they're going to frame that. They could frame it as just, that is the worst feedback I've had. They could frame it to say that's really useful and constructive. But I think as the middle people in that relationship, it's I don't want to make out recruitment as being a hard job, but that is one of the hardest parts. And I think the industry need to get better at it. So again, speaking to someone like yourself about how we can improve that, I think is really important. Yeah,
I think use what you're getting in the moment, but also I think there's something about how are you starting off the conversation. So there's something, you used the word empathy earlier. So, there's something about acknowledging, I'm really sorry you didn't get, I know you're going to be upset. I hope you take the feedback in the spirit with which it's intended. I know you didn't get the outcome, but I hope with this feedback, it will be helpful for you. And if possible, maybe I can signpost you to other places to look or what you could do next. But there's something about how are you starting off that conversation. If you go because you've got your own busy to-do list, if it's like you're straight in and there's none of those niceties, there's none of that acknowledgement of the other person's pain, well, what do you expect you're going to get back?
Yeah, that's
right.
Really good point. And I think in an industry that is so notoriously driven by commission and moving on to the next thing, which is going to get you closer to making money, there are some incredibly conscientious, empathetic recruiters out there that genuinely are focused on providing this really strong candidate experience and ultimately human experience. And they need to be given the time to actually have those empathetic conversations rather than, okay, you spent 60 seconds on that call telling the candidate they didn't get the job, now move on to the next one. So that's a more industry-wide issue.
Exactly. Well, and also it's not your job, it's not your recruitment colleagues' jobs to solve someone's anger. That person's emotions and feelings are legitimate. They're disappointed. And there's something about, again, you know, if you think about the UK culture, stiff upper lip and that, we're taught from a very early age to be uncomfortable with most emotions. And so when somebody's angry, when somebody expresses that, we either think we have to solve it or we have to shut it down. No, just let it be. Yeah. It's not a bad thing. They're upset. It shows they're passionate. And also, it's not your job to solve it. Yeah. It's theirs to own, not yours to own.
Yeah, that's a super powerful message, I think, for people receiving feedback and for maybe any other people in my profession that are giving it, or leaders giving it as well. You mentioned culture and the British culture of kind of suppressing emotions or being taught that we should try and hide emotions. Do you think feedback and the way people receive it differs across different cultures then? Because you mentioned specifically British and from an emotional perspective, but does feedback differ across cultures, how we receive and how we give it?
Yeah, and not just cultures. So I talk a lot, again, particularly with students, about what we call intersectionality. So how different aspects of who we are cross over. So then when you lay on top not just our cultural background, so whether or not I'm from the UK, or maybe my parents, maybe I was born here but my parents were born elsewhere, or my gender, my age, my education, my class, lay all that stuff on top of each other. And that's what makes us beautifully unique, but that's also what will impact how we handle things such as honest conversations and giving and receiving feedback. Many years ago now, I was approached to help resolve conflict in this team. So pretty much every team member was at each other's throats. And when they weren't, they literally did not talk to each other. The only way they communicated with each other was via post-it note or email, and they all sat together. They'd been through 9 managers in 7 years. It was tough. And actually, when I did my research, so I interviewed each of them ahead of designing the first kind of team intervention session. What came out to me was the diversity that could have and should have been a strength for them was actually a detriment to them, because they hadn't learned about each other or understood each other. I'll give you an example of one. There was an older gentleman in the team. He was from Mauritius. He was in his early 60s. So he's an older gentleman, and for him, it was really important that younger people respected their elders, knew their place, and he was constantly clashing with this younger Nigerian woman in her 20s who had been brought up to express herself. She was very loud, and so they were constantly, neither was wrong, they just hadn't learned to understand each other's positions, backgrounds. And so a lot of the work I did with them was helping each other learn about each other and understand each other's backgrounds. Professionally, personally, getting them to kind of share some stories with each other about what matters to them, and that's at the heart of good relationships that allows us to navigate difficult conversations, is knowing each other. The more familiar we are with each other in a way that's comfortable for us, the more it oils the wheels of those conversations. So great question, John, and I think it's quite complex because you've got multi-layers of the things that make up who we are.
Yeah, and as you say, it's multiple layers. It's so many different facets that build up that our uniqueness as well. Cultural sensitivity is a term I was introduced to about 7 or 8 years ago now, and it comes up a lot in leadership again. Do leaders have the cultural sensitivity to manage global teams where you're working with different countries and with that different cultures as well? And I thought I'd ask the question because I had the feeling that it would make a difference, and it very clearly does. But again, you can work to break. It's not even breaking down the boundaries. It's all about understanding, is it? It's knowledge is power, and just understanding, again, sorry to Hayley students' context of the individual as well. So it makes sense. I'm conscious of how much time we've got left, so I'm going to ask 2 more questions, if that's all right, before we close out with the closing tradition on this podcast. What are your top 3 tips for giving constructive feedback?
So the first is allow sufficient time and space for the conversation. Don't try and hurry it. So I'd always allow more time than you probably thought. If the conversation ends earlier, happy days, you get some time back. But allow sufficient time and space, because there's something about honouring the conversation. The second is note down the most important thing you want to say. Often what can happen, particularly if we're anxious about the conversation, is if we haven't noted it down, we get anxious, we build ourselves up, we know we've got to say that thing, but suddenly a litany of every wrong thing this person's ever done comes out like machine gun fire. And so the person's feeling like hitting all directions, but also which of those things is important. So keep yourself true and note it down as it's almost like an anchor. So 1 or 2 points. What are the main points you want to get across? And the third is practice. If it's a conversation that you're particularly worried about for whatever reason, as I said earlier, if you've got a trusted colleague or even a friend or family member that you can just say, could I just have 10 minutes with you? I just want to play through this conversation. This is what I'm thinking of saying. And there's a real power in that, as I say, because you've already done it. So it almost takes the fear out of it. And also you can get some good feedback from your colleague or your friend that might help you in the conversation. So yeah, those are the 3 main things that I would suggest that certainly others that I've worked with have found works.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I'll put you on the spot there, Hayley, as well, but they're really useful and actionable tips. The last proper question, and you'll understand what I mean in a second. Technology and the introduction of technology during the pandemic and the way we're now working, what role do you think that's played in how we give feedback now and how it's impacted feedback? Do you think it's been a positive introduction or to the detriment of the quality of the feedback in both how it's received and given as well?
Again, typical psychologist, I'm going to say it depends. So some people do it really well, some people not so well. I think those who have used it, so for example, if they've got hybrid working or 100% virtual working still, I think those people who've navigated that and having important conversations and honest conversations and kind of feedback, those who've done that really well, one of the things they've done is worked on the ground rules with people on how to have that conversation in this space and kind of documenting those. So, for example, make it clear when you've finished what you're saying so that the other person doesn't awkwardly jump in, which is what we can tend to do in virtual space. Make it clear if it's okay for the camera to be off or if you'd prefer it on. And again, we need to take into account different things there. So some people are embarrassed about their home setup. Some people, there might be neurodivergence. So, for example, I have an autistic client who doesn't like the camera on. And so I honour that. But we've had that conversation at the start, and that's one of our ground rules. So those who've navigated this space well have come up with some clear criteria that everybody can work to. Those who haven't.
Yeah, of course, there's the opposite side of the coin, isn't there? But I think that's really powerful, again, for organisations. The reason I asked that question as well is because there is a real drive now at the moment to get people back into the office, especially in large consulting companies are calling their people back in droves for 4 or 5 days a week in the office. And I just think maybe, well, it's not maybe, from my opinion, it's poor management that is driving those decisions for the most part. I know specific sectors and industries will have various different needs, but on the whole, it's poor leadership and poor management and probably not addressing things like ground rules and in that particular virtual environment. That's so powerful. So hopefully any leaders listening to this that are on the fence about, oh God, everyone else is doing it, maybe we should do it. Differentiate yourself by having some conversations. That's my call to action for people.
The final thing I'd say around that is the mistake that many of us made at the start of the pandemic, and some of us continue to make, is we assumed that we could pick up what we did in person and simply drop it into virtual. And that's not the case at all. Good virtual facilitation, good virtual meeting management, good virtual conversations require more thought and more planning. And because so many of us in corporate life are so time strapped, so stressed, we feel we don't or we don't allow ourselves the time or space, or feel we don't have the time or space to put that essential thought or planning in. And so the easier thing to do is just get everybody back in. But what I'm going to do is pretend it's about the fact we're more creative when we're together, or we're more productive when we're together. And we know that's true in some cases, but not others.
Yeah.
Deep thought and planning is what's required. And that's something I found myself, I found it as a university lecturer. I found it as a coach and a facilitator. I made some big old mistakes back in 2020, but I've definitely kind of learned that if I just make that time and effort to plan a bit more carefully and think this is a virtual space, I'm going to need to do things slightly differently, it pays dividends, and you can still have powerful conversations and powerful sessions.
Hayley, that was incredible. Thank you so much for that, because I really like the fact we've ended on that, because it's such a hot topic of conversation at the moment, this drive back into the office. So I think hopefully people will listen to that and realise it's probably they've got some work to do on their own leadership and some questions to ask themselves as well. Before we move on to the closing tradition, I'm also just going to say to anyone listening, Hayley mentioned her sketch notes earlier. If you don't know what a sketch note is, first of all, look it up, but specifically look up Hayley's sketch notes, because these are, again, one of the reasons that I reached out to Hayley. If you love learning in a visual way and visual messages, Hayley's sketch notes are incredible, and they're also done in old school pen and paper and then scanned. I mean, who does that anymore? Hayley does, but it's absolutely incredible. So look them up. I'll obviously include the link to Hayley's LinkedIn profile on the websites in the podcast description as well. Right, closing tradition. Have you got time for this, Hayley? This won't take too long.
Yeah.
Is that okay? Right. So the closing tradition on this podcast, and you might have listened to some that have also got a closing tradition where a previous guest will leave a question for the current guest. Now, we don't do that here because this is my podcast, and my mum asked the questions, Hayley. So I'm going to play...
Love that.
I'm going to play a question from my mum down the phone to you. Now, I don't listen to these questions before they're played, so I don't know what mum's going to say. She knows who I'm speaking
it's
to.
It's risky.
It's very risky, as it's turned out on a number of episodes, actually. But she knows what you do. Beyond that, let's just see what happens. I'll try and make sure it's the right volume when we start.
Hi, Dr. Hayley. Using positive feedback, how can I get my husband to be a better cook? Thank you.
Oh, Mum. Bless you.
First of all, your mum, what a hero.
I think she's in the hairdressers. That's the background noise there.
I love that.
Yeah. Lisa. Yeah. Lisa is her name, if you want to direct the answer.
Oh, Lisa. Lisa, I love your question. So I think there's three things for you to think about. The first is define what you mean by better cook.
Okay, good point.
So do you have like a couple of criteria in mind? So if your husband was a better cook, so what's your husband's name?
It's Harry.
Is it your dad?
Harry, yes, Harry.
Harry, I love it. My granddad was called Harry. So if Harry was a better cook, how would you know that? So if there are one or two things that would tell you he's a better cook. So for example, he might use more seasoning. And so once you're clear on that, then you need to kind of tell him that. So you need to kind of be specific, saying it would be great if you could use more seasoning.
Right, okay.
In the future. And then third is positive reinforcement. So because none of us just likes to be criticised all the time. So on that occasion where he does cook something that you like, tell him, praise him, and be specific on what made it a good dish.
Yeah.
Because feedback is about being specific. So not just specific on what's not right, it's also what's right. So yeah, those are the three things that pop into my head, and it's also based on my own experience with my own husband as well. Good luck, Lisa.
Sure, Mum will absolutely love that. I think her main barometer for Harry getting better at cooking is probably starting to do it. I
was going to say just cooking.
I don't think that's unfair to say. If you're listening to this, Dad, I'm sorry about that. Anyway, that's the closing tradition. Thank you for indulging that question, and thank you again for Mum to get involved on that as well. Hayley, it has been invaluable, this conversation, and you've been so generous with your time, and I know that so many hopefully people listening to that will get so much from it. We've referenced loads of books, loads of thinkers in this space, loads of inspiration that I want to include in the podcast description. So I may reach out to some of those references as well, just to ensure that I've got the right links. But thank you so much. It's been a genuine pleasure. You're very, very welcome. Thanks for having me. And thanks for listening, everyone. Yeah, lovely stuff. All right, Hayley, I'll speak to you soon. Thank you. Take care. See you later. Thanks for listening to Jobsworth. If you enjoyed this episode, please feel free to like and subscribe. You can stay connected by following me on LinkedIn for more insights on the world of work, behind the scenes content, and updates on upcoming episodes. We're already thinking about guests for season 2, so if there is a particular topic you'd like us to discuss, then please send in your suggestions to hello@jobsworth.com.